would say, Cheryl Strayed would say, shut the fuck up. Yeah, Cheryl, I'm 5 seconds late because I was in their energy all morning. And Cheryl, I love you so much. It's going to be hard because I could spend a day with either or any and all, but I'm going to use your famous quote to start this talk. Let's embrace the motherfucking shit out of it. Out of life. I don't know where to start. I'm going to start with you and get over to you. And then we'll crescendo with you, and then we'll ask some questions. Florence, does everyone know Florence? Did anyone see her talk yet? Yes! She's written this book, The Nature Fix, all around us. You are doing the science of what you two have explored in your heart and in your lives. So give us a little bit of the science. I think we're all aware of the basics, but tell us some of the things you discovered as you wrote this book. You have...
give me a limit.
Take us to the heart of it, man, because these talks are quick. We got to get
to
I'll be Nature efficient. Teaches us to slow down. Mountainfilm teaches us to hurry the fuck up.
Okay. Hi. Good morning. Good morning. I'm sure everyone in this room appreciates and understands the power of nature, because here we are. And I think we've all experienced the awe, experience that sense of unity and oneness, and how that can shift our brains and shift our thinking. There's been a lot of new science over the last decade or two, kind of founded in some interesting environmental psychology of the 1970s. And lately there's been more ways to image actually what's going on in the brain. What are the biomarkers of that change? So people are taking portable EEG monitors into the field. They're doing brain scans, lots of interesting ways to kind of measure the physiology of your nervous system and see how it changes, even after 15 minutes in nature. But I think for the sake of this panel, it'd be interesting to sort of talk a little bit more about wilderness and sort of the deeper immersions in nature. And those are, frankly, I think, harder to study. It's harder to study the effects of how our brains and our lives and our psyches really change over many weeks in the wilderness. I did spend some time with some veterans with post-traumatic stress on a wilderness trip, and researchers are really interested in that population because there are so many. And we know that conventional therapies are not helping them, or not helping them enough. And that wilderness therapy may be a great kind of adjunct to do with other traditional therapies, because it creates bonds between people. They support each other to go to conventional therapy and follow through with conventional therapy, which is one of the problems. I mentioned in my talk yesterday that I'm particularly interested in this emerging science of awe. And I think with things like trauma and grief, when we experience awe, it can be very powerful in making us feel less alone, even while it makes us feel sort of smaller in the perspective of the universe. And so I'd be really interested in talking more about that. Awe can be kind of an antidote to PTSD, because it forces you to engage with the stimuli because it's so beautiful around you, or it's so powerful, or it's impossible to ignore because there's hail, landing on your climbing harness. I'm interested in the fact that a lot of people are so drawn to extreme sports and extreme environments who have suffered grief, who have suffered trauma. So I think that's another place to explore.
I came to your talk yesterday, and I'm particularly excited that we're starting to re-educate kids. We're starting to put them into nature as a quote classroom. And tell us about some of those results, because I think the most effective way to change the way we live is to change the youth and raise a new generation. So how's that?
Agree.
What are you discovering there?
Well, all I can say is it's about time. I think kids have been really disconnected from nature, for a couple of decades now. When I grew up, I was outside every day. I think probably most of you were in this room. A statistic I shared the other day is that only 71% of parents today say their kids do not go outside every day. So that's a huge, a profound shift in a generation or two. The studies do show that in these forest kindergartens, where kids are outside and exposed in sort of early childhood, they are sort of behind their peers when they get to conventional schools in academics. And this is in Europe, where you don't have to do academics in kindergarten. They're behind their peers academically until 3rd grade, and then they catch up. But they're way ahead of their peers, and they stay ahead of their peers on measures of social and emotional regulation. You know, and that's the resilience that kids need to be successful. They're ahead of their kids in peer interaction, in leadership, in self-confidence. You know, on a lot of these tangibles that we know are critical life skills that so many kids are not getting the benefit of really taking to their full potential because they're inside 4 walls all day and they're on devices.
Yeah, one of my favorite poets is Mary Oliver, and she's an educator, and she's watched children who, of course, are natural learners, right? Nature, the fact that we have to identify it as a classroom is silly, but natural learners, naturally curious, and by the time she says they get to high school, we have trained the authenticity, the spark, the light out of them. That's why when I meet my college students, they're oftentimes depressed, medicated. You sound that looks like
I'm agreeing.
Yeah.
We don't really know why college students today seem to be worse off emotionally than a generation ago. But, you know, certainly you can look at the graphs, you know, of time spent outside, and there certainly is a match. As time spent outside decreases, a lot of these kind of indoor diseases like depression, anxiety, obesity, they are increasing. I'm so concerned about this. I just think we're at a crossroads right now where we have a choice to make. And it's either recognize this disconnection, this profound disconnection from nature, and do something about it, try to correct course. And we see states like Oregon have now passed this great Prop 99 to use lottery funds to get every 4th and 5th grader in the state into outdoor school once a week. So that's a school that's changing. I mean, that's a district.
Once a year.
Sorry, but it's for a whole week, right?
Yeah.
Okay, whole week, once a year. But every single kid, so that's access for every single kid. Because access is a serious social justice issue. And some kids have access to nature and a lot of kids don't.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a theory as to why. It's anecdotal, but I've been educating for 11 years. Our school system teaches young people, tries to train young people, turn young people into what they must become rather than waking them up into who they are. And that's what nature does. Nature reminds us, it takes us back to the very primal origins of who we are. It strips us of the story and the pressures, and it reawakens us to that essential original energy.
Yeah, that's lovely. I think that idea of self-concept, you know, is something you see in the literature too. And it's something that time outside, you know, can really help facilitate.
Okay, I'm going to jump to you. Damn, Cheryl. Oh, my goodness. It's funny, you know, we come to these festivals and we all talk about nature. We forget that we're nature. We talk about it as if it's something else outside of us, but we're nature. And Emerson has this quote that reminds me of you, and I'm going to butcher it, but I hope I get the essence of it. We look up to nature. But if we would live with the right energy, nature would look up to us. And this is a woman who I believe lives with the right nature. And I can't get out of your work Tiny Beautiful Things. Yeah. How many of you have read Tiny Beautiful Things? Here's what I think nature is.
I also wrote this other book called Wild. Wild gets all the attention.
I know it. I get it.
Tiny Beautiful Things has this fierce cult following. Yeah.
I get it. I think they're the same thing. I really do.
I do too.
I think they're the same thing. I think you're authentic, and that's why. Again, you know, we're all here, but I think we're moths to that flame of authenticity. So would you speak to that, because you had to go through a process,
Right.
you know, that I think a lot of us are afraid of. You know, one quick note. Yesterday I saw the film about the science furthest. Anyway, you see Furthest?
I haven't yet.
NASA sends the Voyager into space to tell us who humans are. They won't send up a picture of us naked. NASA rejects it. I think you would have sent a picture of, you would have sent a porn video. and that's because it's who we,
And it would have been a damn good one.
Exactly.
There's my husband back here. There, he would be partaking.
We have cameras. We have cameras. Okay, never mind. Okay.
Okay. Oh, you want me to talk about my
Please,
future
I
porn
set
film?
it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to say, it's so interesting listening to Florence speaking about science and what she has learned through her research and what other scientists have learned through their research. Because of course, everything she was saying, I recognized was relevant to me. I wrote about these things from just a personal perspective in Wild. Things like the way there's a chapter in Wild called The Accumulation of Trees. What happens to us, what happened to me after I woke up every morning for 94 days sleeping under the trees. And something did happen. My life was changed. And the most interesting thing to me, I'm out of breath at this elevation. The most interesting thing to me, and also all that talk about porn, it gets to me, is, okay, so Wild was published 5 years ago. And what I have received, one thing that happens when you write a book is it's yours, you're there in your room, it all belongs to you. And then you give it to the world, and it belongs to the people who read it, who love it. And what I have received are just countless. There's not a day that has gone by in the 5+ years that it's been out that I haven't received many, many emails or people who come up to me and they share their stories with me. And so many of them are about their ventures into the wilderness. A lot of people felt inspired to go into the wilderness because they read Wild. And sometimes that wilderness, I define wilderness in all kinds of ways. For some people, that was like being brave enough to walk into their local city park by themselves and see what that feels like. And I think that, one of the most powerful, take a deep breath, things about going into the wilderness is that sense of perspective. As Florence said, so many people go there feeling lost, like I did, feeling really sort of absorbed in their own suffering or the suffering of the world. And what happens when you go into the wild is inevitably you're faced with beauty. One of my quotes in my book, Brave Enough, it's really my mom's quote, put yourself in the way of beauty. Every day we always have that opportunity. My mother would say there's always a sunrise and always a sunset, and no matter what's happening in your life, you get to choose whether you're going to be there for it or not, that beauty. And it's available to us. And I think that when we go into the wild, there it is. It's undeniable. And it's ours. That's a powerful experience that stays with us, I think, always. I also think going into the wild, builds perspective. There is death in the wild, and there is always life, too. And when we see that in nature, we inevitably see that in ourselves. We are connected to all of those living things. And, I think that's, again, once we gain those experiences, is why it's so important for kids to have them. They really belong to us, and they do accumulate in that same way that the opposite does. If you grew up in a house where every day somebody's telling you you're a piece of crap, you have to find a way to, that has accumulated in you, and you need to find a way to answer that with something beautiful, and the wild offers us that.
Yeah, and again, I want to bridge these ideas because I do think that our society has forgotten the essence of being. And that's what I think happens in nature, is just being rather than doing and achieving. You write really well, Cheryl, again, I think they're just the same unifying idea that, anyone who tells you what you got to be, anyone who tells you that your income is a measure of who you are, does not understand life. And I think, is that the kind of idea that...
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting to me about going into nature, too, is it almost always requires us to test our physical strength. And, I do think that there's something about that, like even something as simple as walking. As I wrote in Wild, when I set off on my hike, I was like, well, this is going to be pretty easy because, I can walk. I walk all the time. I'm a waitress. And then I got out there and I was like, it turns out it's something a little harder, and so and what happens when something's hard and you keep doing it is you can't help but think of yourself as strong. You can't help but think of yourself as, you know what? I just climbed up and down that mountain. I did it. And you can tell me I did it slowly. You can tell me I'm overweight. You can tell me whatever it is. But I know I did that thing, and you can't take that away from me. And this is why, and this is an ancient practice, and throughout all time and all of our cultures, we've given people rites of passage that ask them to do something physically hard. And for a lot of women who have given birth, they'll say, that is the most spiritual experience of my life, usually because it was the hardest, most physically painful, and they endured it. Or the hike you went on, or the climb, or whatever it was. And I do think it allows us to see ourselves as strong. And that's a really important experience. And I'm with you, Tom, when you say it's not becoming somebody different, it's actually remembering who we are. Right. You were all born strong. And we sometimes forget that along the way, but going into nature allows us to remember our original strength.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way to put it. And I'd also love to just to emphasize what the research is showing about girls. Because girls, especially right now, need to find their strength. And there's actually a bravery gap, which I think is fascinating, between boys and girls. If you ask boys and girls, do you feel brave? Way more boys than girls say they do. And so what's going on there? Why are these girls not feeling brave? And it's probably because they were told from an early age that it's okay to ask for help, that it's okay to be helpless, that it's okay not to be strong. And yet we know that a sense of bravery is incredibly important for girls to actually go after their dreams and then for them to recover from failures. They need to get back up and do it again because life will present them those. And that's why another reason why I think outdoor programs especially and being outside is so important for kids, but especially girls.
In a related note, I learned yesterday, Paul Hawken did a talk on, he put together the 100 things to have us restore this world. He has a better way of phrasing it. What's the name of the book? Does anyone remember? Drawdown. Say it again? Drawdown. Yeah, Drawdown. But he's very positive in his imagery. What do you think the number one environmentally, quote, conscious, healthy thing that we can do as a species? Do you guys know? It's very related to what you just said. Empower women. Yeah. Because when you empower women and involve women in the vision of a society, allow them to be creative and participatory, then they have less children, and less children means a lot less stress on the planet. So just one last thing, and then I'll introduce Tyler. Just the image of the monster on your back. Did you ever see The Mission?
The monster?
Yeah,
yes.
the monster's
Yeah, I know. I know.
Did you ever see The Mission?
Did I see The Mission?
You know The Mission, the movie?
I didn't see it.
Okay, it just reminded me of The Mission, and you'll speak obviously more eloquently. But Robert De Niro sinned.
Okay.
He was in the church in whatever the 1700s, and he sinned, and he had to put all this weight on his back and climb up a mountain.
Oh yeah.
And so, speak to us about the monster.
Well, the beautiful thing about life and writing about life is that it hands us all kinds of symbols and meaning, right? So when I was writing Wild, I actually, I honestly did have an incredibly heavy backpack that I nicknamed Monster. And Monster was, my friend and my mortal enemy out there on the Pacific Crest Trail. And I lived with it. It still lives with me in my basement, in a place, it feels really disrespected at this point. It's always like, I'm fucking famous now, girl. But what's amazing is all that stuff I wrote about Monster is just literally true. And so, when I was writing Wild, I was like, wow, this whole damn thing is a metaphor, right? I have this weight that I cannot bear, that I have to bear, that is true for all of you too. That all of you, in the course of your lives, will have something that feels unbearable to you, that you're going to just have to figure out how to bear. And, we have some of those are temporary and some of those are lifelong, right? So I realized, this physical thing, the lessons I learned on the PCT, these actual, things that I learned were also metaphorical. They sort of seeped over into the kind of the emotional and the spiritual realm. And I do think that, again, these are the opportunities we give ourselves when we go into nature. We can see a river is both a river and a metaphor. And I live in the poetic. I live for that kind of stuff. I think that this, to me, I don't believe in God as defined, but I believe in the divinity of nature. And I think that when we are in nature, if we listen, if we pay attention, if we think kind of outside that literal meaning of things and think about, well, what is the river? How is the river connected to me? What is the story the river is telling me about my life, about all of our lives, about all of humanity? And that to me is ultimately the most sacred power of nature.
Beautiful. Speaking of having to carry something on our back, and your back, Tyler lost a friend, his best friend. Ben Kesey is here. Ben, stand up for one second. This is a young man that I admire greatly, one of the founders of Invisible Children. You can applaud for him. And the energy of these young people serving their brothers gave me hope and helped me rest in the idea that we're going to be okay because we're in good hands. And you, in the middle of that energy loss, a friend in a terrorist bombing, and you coped with it a certain way that's related to the topic. So would you just talk a little bit, Tyler, about,
Sure.
And the name of your film is?
The name of the film is A Field Guide to Losing Your Friends. To which a lot of people sometimes like, that's so funny, and I'm like, it's not. So just getting back to being naked, here's an interesting fact. Most of you, probably all of you, have seen me naked at some point. That is, Mountainfilm decided in those opening montages to use the scene of me skinny dipping down the beach. But in that, the reason I was naked on the beach was because, as Tom said, 2010, there was a series of bombings that went off in Kampala, Uganda, one of which killed my best friend, Nate Henn. 74 people were murdered in those attacks. And that, to me, was somewhat of an inciting incident that led me to nature. It had always been around me. I grew up in Montana, so it's kind of inherent in your upbringing when you're there. But in the midst of this loss, I had then, just 4 days later, coincidentally moved to Estes Park, Colorado, to start working at this wedding chateau, and it was located right outside Rocky Mountain National Park. So I just started every free moment I had going for hikes into the park, and the more I withdrew, the more I just started exploring and analyzing the nature around me and finding solace in the peace and the silence and disconnecting from this world that had brought me so much inflicting mental illness, because it wasn't necessarily the loss of Nate that generated this hurt and self-harm. It was decades of compounding depression and suicidality as well. I just really struggled with reasons to get out of bed and reasons to decide to keep living each day. And so when you see how destructive we can be to each other, especially after seeing a movie like City of Ghosts last night, it's hard to say I want to continue with this long fight that we're fighting, whether it be with these elements of climate change that we're seeing that can be so disheartening and defeating and can lead to apathy and paralysis, or when you see these social issues that also can be equally as defeating and paralyzing. I think it's good sometimes to just disconnect, go out in nature, and watch how a wildflower grows. Because it will remind you, as Cheryl said, of the divinity that is located within nature. Because a lot of the times, especially with Western culture, you get these narratives of treating death as unnatural, and that ultimately will lead to treating life as unnatural. So when my friends would die, and Nate wasn't the only one, I had a series of friends kill themselves and drownings and hantavirus, and it was a bad half-decade. But you get this narrative where people say, oh, they're in a better place, or you just can't understand this plan. And that didn't work for me. But when I went into nature, I found this alternative narrative that said, we are all ultimately bioorganic matter that's going to die. We live, we die, we resurrect. You see it in every new cycle in the seasons each year. And that's okay. And it reminded me that it's okay to die. that you don't have to fear it. You don't have to resent it. It's not our enemy. It's just as miraculous as birth is because it's the counter to it. And we need to stop treating it as if it's our enemy throughout our life, but a blessing that we get to go through at some point when it does come. Whether it be a bombing in Kampala generated by humanity, or cancer, or old age, whatever it may be, but what a beautiful life we get to live. And we just got to enjoy it and get out amongst each other and amongst ourselves. And that was one thing that I really learned, because the more I withdrew and became so isolated in that pain, what really reconnected me with humanity was like seeing how amazing nature was, but then getting to invite my friends to come out with me and say, come check out the bison of Montana, come to Yellowstone, let me show you the geothermal activity, or let's go skinny dipping on the Channel Islands, or whatever, like, come be alive with me.
And first of all, beautiful. Yeah. I mean, you've hit to the heart of it. The thought and insight that you just shared is the heart of it. You know, when I saw my mother die, somehow I was able to overcome the fear of that process. You know, if you see the Ram Dass movie, he says that, you know, the mystics believe it's like taking off a tight shoe after a long day. Whatever you believe, you know. Again, Mary Oliver believes at least our biochemistry goes somewhere, and so the energy rolls forward. And if there's a spirit, maybe that rolls forward, but it's a process. And look at this. This is why I have hope. Look at this young man who knows what it took me 30 more years to uncover. You know that. So I want to take one other step into your journey, because your journey also was rolled forward by a failure.
Yeah.
And we don't see the value of failure, of trying things and failing. And you had a failure that propelled you into the longer journey.
Yeah. All right, so listen to this shit. I love storytelling, and I love a good story arc, but this one's twisted. So when I moved to Rocky Mountain National Park, was coping with this loss, as a lot of people are wont to do, and as you see kind of with that trope of using nature to heal, I then kind of immediately looked at the biggest mountain and said, I'm going to hike that. I'm going to hike that in the hopes that if I can get over that mountain, I can get over my loss. So I kind of acclimated to that elevation, hiked a lot that summer, and at the end of it, I attempted to hike Long's Peak, the highest point in northern Colorado. It's 14,259 feet. So I went out there, I went alone, woke up really early, did the hike, got to this point called the Boulder Field, where then you have to go through an opening called the Keyhole. But being the idiot that I am, I went to this thing called the False Keyhole. Which the False Keyhole kind of takes you to this 1,000-foot cliff, and there was like climbing bolts, and I'm horrified of heights. And so it was very scary, and there was some instances where I thought I might die. That's all to say I didn't make it to the top of this mountain, which then becomes this overarching metaphor for not overcoming loss. So after that, and kind of living in and near Rocky Mountain National Park, I thought to myself, this park's pretty cool. And I grew up right outside Yellowstone as well, equally cool place. So I said, you know what, I think I'm going to attempt this goal to visit all the U.S. national parks. And that's what I did. So I've currently been to 53 of the 59, and after 4 years and after visiting all these parks, I said, you know what, I think it's time to return to that mountain. I think I've kind of fulfilled this process, and I think it's time to really let go. So I went back, and I made it to the top. But the twisted part, I came upon a dead body on that mountain. So it was death that had brought me there, and in coming back, death said, I'm not done with you. But yet, as with any good story arc, there was change. So I looked at this body, and it was just strewn across the rocks. He'd fallen off a cliff, blood and brains everywhere. It was just horrific. But yet, in that moment and sitting with this body, there was something utterly beautiful about it, and utterly cathartic, because after you see the way we treat death in our society as something removed, something different, we hide bodies, we decorate them, we we don't see the grit and the gristle, and we don't see the blood and the guts, and this was wild, and it was nature. It was natural death, and after all the things I had seen and been through, this was so real to me. It was the organic. It didn't have that bullshit that comes with so many things we put into our society. And I just sat with this body. But yet, I knew something was suspicious about it. Instantaneously, I said, this is a suicide. And after spending so many days and years of my life just wanting to die, there was this 18-year-old kid from Kansas dead in front of me. And I said, that body could be me. It should have been me. But it wasn't. And that was this freedom to forgive myself, to forgive my depression, and to really let go. And so I'm showing a movie tonight at the Palm Theater. It's at 6:45. It's called The Field Guide to Losing Your Friends. That part of the story is not in the narrative, but I also have an accompanying book of the same title, and it's much darker. But it focuses way more on the death and the depression and the suicide, and that part of the story is in there. So if you want something more optimistic, see the film. If not, check out the book.
I got to tell you, I'm utterly optimistic listening to you. You're demonstrating the kind of courage that I think we've been trained out of or lost, which is, and Cheryl, you know this, and you study this, which is the courage to sit in that and to see what it has to say. I see you nodding. Is there anything you want to say about it?
Well, first I want to say to my husband, it's time to go get in line for the movie. It is. Anyway, please do it soon. But anyway, what was the question? No.
He was.
Yeah, no, it's just sit in that, to sit in that, and yeah, just sit in that sorrow. I mean, and I think, what we've all said too, this idea of nature offering us that the full perspective of life that we as humans so often try to deny, right? I mean, we all have a few things in common, but for sure we're all going to die, right? Everyone in this room, and that strangely comes as a kind of a revelation periodically to us, right? Like we think we all assume that we're going to get up tomorrow morning. Every one of us in this room does. And we probably will, but we might not. And that's such a huge thought to have. I mean, I think most of us spend all of our lives trying to even comprehend that, and many don't. And I do think, Brian, my husband, who I just sent away, and Tom, you mentioned this too. So Brian's mother died last September, and she was 83, and we were with her as she slowly died over the course of a few weeks. And it's just such an amazing process to witness somebody else's death, but she was absolutely terrified. I mean, terrified. And just would not ever allow herself to accept her death, no matter what Brian did, no matter what he said to her, or chants, or prayers, or, and she just died in terror because she was afraid of death. And, I do think that, that powerful story you just told, sitting in the sorrow with this 18-year-old man thinking this could be me. And what I think you're talking about there is you could have decided to kill yourself, right? You didn't, but it's going to be someday you dead, right? And I think that when we contemplate other people's deaths, as we do in nature, other living things' deaths as well, we're forced to reckon with our own. And I don't see that as something we should push away. I do see that as something we should embrace. Nature gives us the opportunity to do that every day.
And it reminds us that there are limits. There's this school of thought that I think is a false school of thought that says you can do anything and be any. No, you can't. Right. In the NBA, it's not going to happen.
That's right.
There are limits.
I still have hope for you, Tom. With the NBA.
They did call me the Lebanese leaper when I was growing up.
That's right.
Very good. But we're in space and time, people. We're in space and time, and everything is contrast. If you had a great meal last night, it's because you ran all day to movie after movie and you didn't eat all day. That was a limit. And so it allowed for the beauty. I always tell my students that shit makes the best fertilizer. And death, I think, is the ultimate, the ultimate limit. And I interviewed that group yesterday, the two Australians. Anybody see their movie, Susie and the Simple Man? Beautiful. And she faced a cancer diagnosis. But she said there was a gift in that because it helped her to embrace the life she had, with uncertainty. Wow, you guys are amazing.
Yes.
Let's just stay here all. Let's just shut the door. Let's just hold up.
I've got a movie to get to.
Right now? This morning?
No, I'm going to go see a movie at 9:45. Just
You're
for the
going to
record.
get in.
Yeah, I know. My husband's standing in line for us.
All right, look, let's open it up to a couple of questions.
The brain imaging, and I thought of it the whole time you were talking, is so important for some of us because, just because. How do you continue with that? How would you use brain imaging for their stories? And maybe especially for actually Cheryl went through it too, for the suicidal impetus and then the recovery from it. How will that work with PET scans?
Brain imaging, she's talking about, and one thing about Florence that's really cool, she's a first-person journalist, meaning she will do all this stuff herself to test the research. So,
But I'm not a neuroscientist, so I have no idea. But I will say that some of the brain studies that have gone on, I think, really confirm what our panelists are saying. For example, we know from studies that after time in a nature setting, part of your frontal cortex that's associated with ruminative thinking and depressive thinking actually deactivates after time, after even just I think it was a 40-minute walk in nature, or maybe it was an hour walk. And I think that that's really interesting because the frontal cortex, not only is it the place where we ruminate and sort of replay our kind of negative thinking, but it's also the part of our brain where we multitask and where we sort of deal with this onslaught of stimulation that we have in modern life. And our brains just aren't supposed to be activated that way all the time. We evolved in nature where stimulation comes at you at a slower pace. And so when that part of your brain deactivates, I think it's a really interesting question to ask, well, what part of your brain is activating instead? And I think it can be the parts of the brain that are associated more with this idea of sitting in whatever emotion you need to sit in. We live in the age of distraction, right? We don't let ourselves sit in that place. There have been studies where you put people in a room with nothing to do and you tell them they can't look at their phone, but there's an electric shock machine that will cause them pain should they want to try it. And some people will press that electric shock 100 times rather than just sit quietly with themselves. And when you're in nature, you are with yourself. You are with your thoughts. There are no distractions to the extent that we have every day.
and one thing that I learned yesterday from your study, which of course we all intuit, don't necessarily.
We will return your call.
That's nature calling.
That's actually the opposite because the study showed that the effects of nature, the restorative healing effects of nature, are diminished, if not completely obliterated, when we walk like this in nature, and then we do this again, and then we talk, right? And yeah.
So yeah, one of the things that has been really interesting to me when I wrote Wild, I wasn't really conscious that I was actually writing about a world that no longer exists, and that is the world without cell phones. And it was actually when I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, is the first time I heard the words cell phone. One of the other hikers, this through hiker who hiked the whole PCT, he was carrying this plastic brick with these numbers on it. And I was like, well, what the hell is that? He said, it's this damn thing called a cell phone, and this company is trying to develop it, and they asked me to carry it on my PCT hike and turn it on at this certain hour every day, so which he did. And to see if it ever got reception, and it never did. And for real, so I met him in California at this place called Kennedy Meadows, and he left it in the PCT hiker free box. And so it was like 6 or 8 of us hikers looking at this weird object. And what we universally agreed on is this product was absolutely going to fail, because who in their right mind would carry a fucking phone around with them everywhere they went? Which is so fascinating, right? Because now we're like, who doesn't, right? My cell phone's right here. And I do think that the wilderness has changed because of cell phones. You know, you can tweet from the Pacific Crest Trail. I've done it. And it's a bummer because you're not alone. You know, when you have that portal to the rest of the world, you're not really alone. You know that feeling when you're really alone and you actually can't reach anybody unless you do it on foot or they come upon you? That's a really profound experience, and we're robbing ourselves of it by taking our phones with us into the wilderness.
Ramiko.
Yes, hi. My question is specifically for Tyler, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So I had some experiences with death, and I discovered that death taught me how to live, and that's like my overall thing that I got from it, right? So for you, what would be that one thing that you got away from, that you pulled away from your experiences with death and how it shaped how you move forward?
I'll answer that with not a quote of my own, but my favorite that does give me reason to live each day. And I believe it's attributed to Gandhi. He said, "Everything you do in this life will be insignificant, but it's very important that you do it." Because as we're kind of talking about this digital age and being able to connect with anybody at any time, at all times of the day, that I think is lending itself to a lot of this mental illness that we're seeing increasing in our population, whether it's anxiety or depression. Because the thing is now, at any point of the day, you can look at your phone and see that somebody somewhere is playing your part better than you. And then we constantly judge ourselves for that and say, how can I improve upon all of this bullshit we're putting into the cultural bandwidth that we're now processing with our prefrontal cortex, and that our brains aren't built to handle? And Florence talks a lot about this. And so the rate at which we're forcing our physiology and psychology to adapt to our modern culture, we can't keep up with that. And so because of that, our bodies are reacting and faltering in different ways through mental illness a lot of the times, or other physiological changes. But with all that in mind, when I look at my phone and when I start feeling so insignificant, I remember everything I do, no matter what, will be insignificant. It's very important. And I would say, being here in Telluride now, here's my challenge to all of you. Go on a hike by yourself, find some place quiet, put your phone in front of you, and say to yourself, can I improve upon the silence? Really question that. And if you can, if you think you legitimately can, pick up your phone and call somebody, but otherwise, sit in it, be okay with it. If it's uncomfortable, get through that. Break through that threshold where you start to feel that regenerative process that nature offers.
Okay, a couple more questions, then we're out. Jackie.
First of all, Tyler and Cheryl, thank you for your stories. Love them. Florence, I have a question for you. I was listening to a podcast the other day that talks about the opposite of depression not actually being happiness, but being curiosity. And the studies that you've seen and the studies they've done, have they shown that putting youth, because you don't really see a depressed 4-year-old ever. Like Tom was saying, kids are naturally just curious. But as we get older, that gets suppressed, we get depressed. Have they done studies where they've taken middle schoolers and high schoolers and purposefully put them in nature to see if it's a natural antidepressant?
That is such a great insight.
Everybody heard that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Curiosity as an antidote.
Yeah, that's a beautiful insight. I'm not aware of studies specifically looking at curiosity as an outcome, but we know that in these kids who do spend more time outside, they are more curious. And in fact, REI just did a study of women, again, I'm on the women kick, that women who spend more time as girls outside are more curious and more adventurous as adults. So I think you can see kind of the legacy, in the adults who did spend time outside. But I think that's a beautiful insight.
Yes.
Hey, I'd be interested in your reflection on the healing effects of nature on leadership and on stewardship. I run the Center for Nature and Leadership. We take adult women leaders from different sectors in the country, meet 4 times in a year, and do some leadership development work in sort of a mindfulness as well as skill set way. But from you three, I'd love to hear your reflections on stewardship for that which you love, as well as just leadership skills in general.
Well, thank you for your work, first of all. Yeah, there are studies correlating time and nature to leadership skills, and also to time and nature with what psychologists call nature connectedness. There actually is a nature connectedness scale, and the higher you are on that scale, the more responsible you feel.
Florence, is that in your book? Because I got the book yesterday. The studies.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Thank you.
Buy the book.
So with leadership, I'm going to define it, a little more, I guess, it's personal power to kind of do and accomplish what you set out to do.
Right?
As a writer, my experience in nature, and especially my experience on the PCT, was enormously helpful, because it turns out that what it takes to hike a long trail is the exact same thing that it takes to write a book. That you just have to do it one step at a time, one sentence at a time, one page at a time. It always feels like it's way too much. It always feels like you can't do it. It always feels like, the end will never come. And you just have to keep moving forward. And there is something really profoundly deep about that message when it comes to, fulfilling your own goals, right, in life. And I think that we all can learn from that kind of, testing ourselves against, that enormous, the endurance it takes to achieve the great things in our lives.
Thank you.
I would say, with my experience, the more you engage in something, and the way that you keep your goals like promises. For me, it was like the national park thing. I could have easily quit after like 4 or 5, but I ended up going to ultimately all of these things. And so that then imbued in me this feeling of stewardship in leadership, to take charge in loving these things that I love, and in that letting other people love me through it. It just became this positive feedback loop. And yet I could have been content like overlooking the Yosemite Valley and saying, this is beautiful. But yet instead, I started learning like the interconnectivity of all these different ecological patterns, and said we need to not just applaud these big monumental views, but protect what is seemingly incredibly ugly of like northeastern Montana, something like that, like the sagebrush steppe or shortgrass prairie. These things that aren't like celebrities in the natural world, but saying they're all important to us. And so I became a huge advocate for these things, and you're seeing it now with like the last month, where it was open to public comments on whether or not we should allow the current government to rescind some of our national monuments, things like this. And this is where we can step up as stewards and as leaders to say, I think this is a positive way to go or not, or like this is the way we should defend nature or not. And these are things we get to decide collectively because they are our public lands.
And if I can just give it 1 second, leaders are great followers. They follow what's true. They follow what's powerful. And nature teaches us humility. You listened really well on your walk. You listened really well in your adventure. You're listening really well to the science. And so we come to them as leaders because they're following what's true. And I want to push us, challenge us for a better word than stewardship. It kind of sounds like we're in charge. And how about kinship? Something that draws out the love and the connection. You would never say, I'm a steward of my daughter. You would say, that's my kin, that's my blood,
Yeah.
So, do we have time for one more question, or do we got to rock? What do you think, Cheryl? You got to freaking go.
We've got 8 minutes.
Okay.
We've got time for at least one more question.
Okay, she had a question first. Yeah, go ahead. And then I'll come up. Yes, ma'am?
I'm not quite sure how to make this into a question, but I want your feelings on this. One of the things that nature does is it inspires us to use our imagination. Our society squelches imagination. And when you think of all the creative souls who have gone out into nature and, before they've written their great symphonies, etc. Can you speak to that? I mean, I think that that is so important, and that we need to really remember that we have to think outside the box, and every individual is so individual and unique, and you don't find that unless you can connect with yourself and be free to accept yourself and accept your ideas and start imagining things that nobody else has ever imagined. and become a creative artist.
I think you wrote about the intro to one of your books. I read it connected with your book this morning about the great symphonies that have been written. Wordsworth.
Well, I do think the romantic poets say it much better, than the scientists. I mean, they got it. Wordsworth talks about this fusing of the human mind with the sky and the grass and the round ocean, which I think is such a beautiful way to look at it. That there is this kind of, there is some kind of energy going back and forth between the human mind and the natural world. And yeah, I would go to the poets.
Well, and there's all kinds of science when it comes to creativity. Creativity is not just sitting there doing the actual work. Of course, you have to do the actual work. But in my writing process, what I've come to realize is it's not just writing; it's walking, alone, and thinking. And that's actually as important to my writing as the writing. Now, if I only walk and think, the book never gets written. That's the bad news. But the good news is, it's not like I'm not escaping my writing when I say I'm going to go for a walk. Napping also has the same thing, which is crazy but true. That you just suddenly I would like drift off for 10 minutes and wake up with the sort of new idea that would allow me to get to the next thing. And there's a really strong correlation between creativity and the mind that is allowed to I guess what we would call rest, but I would say actually wander. It's kind of working by being able to think whatever thoughts come to it. And it's really an important part of creativity, which then, not to get into the whole education system, which I have a lot of concerns about, but that kind of that always on task, structured kind of way of that you're not doing something if you're not doing something is really contrary, I think, to what's true.
I think too, getting back to a previous question about like curiosity and how that's such an inherent trait in children, I think a derivative of that is or of creativity, but yeah, curiosity kind of lends itself to creativity. So for me, the more I kind of explore the natural world, I'm finding curiosity and creativity only expound upon themselves. There's not a well that you can ultimately empty. You can't satiate that. And so I think what's beautiful about it is like you start to learn to explore through all your senses. So initially when I was exploring, I was just looking at things and being like, that's pretty. But then I started like getting down and smelling the flowers, like the sage and the yarrow, and just be like, this is amazing. And I've walked past this how many times throughout my whole life and never noticed it. Or the way something feels or tastes, like it just drives itself. And for me, that really helps my own writing, my own creativity. And I think it's important to not just take these things for granted and take them as something that you can get from, but also to give back and to learn as much as you can about them. I've really gotten into wildflowers lately, whereas I'm a big hiker, and I would just beeline for the top of the mountain, and now it takes me like 2 hours to go a quarter of a mile. People don't hike with me anymore because I'm so curious, and that drives my creativity.
Beautiful. Yes, sir. Well, I think this will be the last question.
Last question.
Right.
No pressure.
Last question.
I was reading the National Geographic article on genius this morning, and the things that I recall was a functional MRI showing that the left and right hemispheres communicate a lot when geniuses are figuring things out. And they also, Keith Jarrett, when playing jazz, the outer portions of his brain shut off in concert with the critical inner voice. That goes away, and then the inner parts of the brain come alive in the midst of improvisation or creative thought. Tyler, I want to know where you are with your journey with depression now, and I'm figuring it probably comes and goes, and what other things besides nature have you found helpful?
Very good
Everybody
question.
heard that question? Okay.
So I have accepted the fact that I will be depressed the entirety of my life. Whether that will be a severe depression or just a mild underlying thing, but it will always be there. And it comes up in weird ways, and I realize it's not like rational thinking where like sometimes I'll get a stain on my shirt and my first thought is, I should kill myself. Doesn't make sense, but this is like how my brain operates. But also too, kind of like getting to the other side of this journey, I don't think I'd want to live without depression anymore, because I see it as this gift I've been given that has given me my worldview, my perspective, my empathy. And now, being where I'm at and being able to like this book to me is like my love letter to anyone that's suffered mental illness or people that have dealt with people suffering with it, which is pretty much everyone. So I love you. But it is dark, and in that I didn't want this light, fluffy piece of literature that just says life is worth living, so many people love you, because when you're depressed, you don't want to hear those things. But it's a real, true account where, like, in one of the stories in there, a friend of mine said, he calls me up and says, I'm going to kill myself. And I said, where are you at? And he was at the cemetery, the dark weirdo. So anyway, I show up, and he's got a knife, and I take it away from him, and we build a snowman. But at the end of it, he said, you're the only person I could have called, and you're the only person that could have saved my life, because you're the only person that gets it. And I think that's what we need to be for each other. This is what I know, and this is how I can help. I couldn't give someone advice that has, say, like anorexia or bulimia or something. That's not my place to say that. But I know depression. And at this point in my life, I'm very grateful for it. And it's going to be a constant struggle throughout my life. Like right now, I don't date people. I don't want children, because I fear that day where, like, what if I pass on that gene? What if I get married and have kids and it's not enough and I still want to die? I fear that. And these are choices I've made, and it's a life that I know I have to live and I get to live. And I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, my response is holy shit. and I mean it literally. You have turned the shit of your life into holiness. And so let's do the same. Let's do the same. All right, everyone. Thank you, guys.